Old age. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you. Anybody from out of town here tonight? Yes, okay, welcome. I hope it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship, okay. I'd like to remind everybody, too, that we do rent out this gorgeous building that I call our hidden gem. And with Thanksgiving coming up, Christmas coming up, what a wonderful place to rent for out-of-towners or small little parties. How impressive you'll be if you do it. So, okay, there you have it. We're in for a real treat tonight, my good friend, and I'm introducing you, you know that. And I'd like to thank Kathy Sachs for sponsoring. Kathy. And of course, our wonderful Titacombs and our partnership for selling the books. We love you. Thank you very much for doing that. Now, the person of the hour. Well, maybe 2 hours. Anthony is the head of security and chief investigator for the Isabella Gardner, Stuart Gardner Museum. He's still working, get with it, on recovering the 13 works of art stolen on March 18th, 1990. What a real whodunit. I bet you know, though. Okay. Over 30 years this is, so. And he's also the co-author of a Wall Street Journal bestseller, Stealing Rembrandts, and author of the New York Times bestseller, The Art of the Con. Oh, could we use that? Okay. Tonight he'll talk about his newest book that we're going to be fascinated with. But I'd also like to say, because we're having our 20th anniversary of 9/11, most people know I was a flight attendant for American Airlines for 38 years, so it's very near and dear to my heart. Anthony was very instrumental in reorganizing the National Homeland Security for the newly formed TSA after 9/11. And he was the lead agent responding to the terrorist attack by the shoe bomber Richard Reed, and I remember that well. And that was in December 2001. And thanks to Anthony and all the work the TSA did, we have been safe so far. Knock on wood. So, boy, you've done a lot, kid. I'd like to introduce you to my good friend, Anthony Amore.
Too good to me, Leslie. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you for coming out. This is actually a really great place. I feel like I should be urging you on to fight the redcoats or something in this area. This is awesome. This morning, I didn't think I was going to be here today. This morning, as I was sitting in the breakdown lane on 93 South, blown radiator out of nowhere, I was thinking, I might have to call Ann and say, I can't make it tonight. But then I thought, Leslie Wallace is introducing me. She has a 757 named after her for American Airlines. So I walked the rest of the way from Somerville. So thank you, Leslie. So I am going to talk to you tonight about a book that's just come out. Well, I shouldn't say just come out. You know, with COVID, everything's messed up for me. Thank you. Thanks. So that's the hardcover. I'm seeing the paperback for the first time. Thank you, Tidkins, for bringing that. And I love this book so much, and I'm really excited to tell you the story about it. And I want to tell you how I came to write it first before I get into this woman's life. So, as Leslie mentioned, I spent the first half of my career, the first 15 years, working to counter terrorism. So I worked for all these different Homeland Security agencies, or agencies that became known as Homeland Security. Most of them don't even exist anymore, and most of them aren't very popular. But we did our job, I hope. So then I went on to the weird world of museums, and believe me, it is really a weird world. And I thought, I saw this job opening with the Gardner Museum, and I've told this story a million times, but it was a very small little opening in the newspaper, and I only applied because I was curious about this place. And I took the job because, how many of you have never been to the Gardner? One. And my heart breaks. You raised your hand last time I spoke 3 years ago, too. But so all of you know that first time you walk in and you see the courtyard at the Gardner Museum, you never forget it. And the place is so important to me. But still, I thought, I'll be here 5 years. I'm going to do 5 years. I had broken up my career into 5-year segments, I thought. And I said, find these paintings. I know it's a hard thing, but 5 years. So 16 years later, I'm still at the Gardner Museum. But this woman, Rose Dugdale, piqued my interest from very early on. So when I started the job, I had to get up to speed in art theft. Right? Who the heck knows about art theft? Except the Bangs Hallett House over here, of course. But anyway, so how do you know about art theft? So I started researching every art heist I could find, and I came across this woman, Rose Dugdale. And I read that she had robbed this place called the Rusborough House in Ireland. And I filed her away in this database I was creating, and I kept coming across her name every so often. And every time I'd read about her, it would contradict everything else I had ever heard about her. In other words, no one ever got her story right. And I was getting intrigued by her because my career has been terrorism and art theft, and her life is defined by terrorism and art theft. Finally, I gave one of these speeches I give about art heists, and inevitably someone asks this question to me. They said, you talk about all these men that have stolen art. Has there ever been a woman who's stolen art? And just as a caveat, I'm talking about big art heists, the major, and there's been a lot of them. So I always answer, well, no, it's always men. All the bad things are done by men, right, guys? I mean, serial killers, murderers, violent crime, you name it, it's men, let's face it. So what is it, the frontal lobe is too small, the adrenal gland is too large, and it leads us to do these things. So every time I gave that answer about men, I'd say, there was this one woman, though, her name was Rose Dugdale, and I'm really fascinated by outliers. 2016, I said to myself, you're going to research everything you can find about her. And it just took me, it was a great distraction for me. When you've been looking for something for 16 years and you can't find it, you need distractions in your life, right? Imagine that was your remote control or your car keys or something. 16 years, you can't find them. So that's been me. So I said, I'm going to focus on her in my spare time. And what I read about her just is mesmerizing, and I learned so much about the era. So the story I'm going to tell you takes place largely between the late 1950s and the mid-1970s. And I was born in 1967. I know it's hard to believe, but I was. And I learned a lot about the time and this period piece and the contrast between this era and today I found fascinating. So it was a great learning experience for me. So without further ado, this is Rose Dugdale. Now, Rose was born to a extremely wealthy family in Devon, in Great Britain. And she was a one-percenter, as we'd call today. And her home was on this large farm called Yardie Farm with these rolling hills. And Rose herself would tell you she enjoyed every pleasure of a privileged youth, from hunting with her father and her friends to horseback riding to just living a life of exclusivity. In fact, she wasn't even allowed to talk to village children. This was, very strong caste system at the time. And she was brought up to curtsy in front of guests, and she went to Miss Ironside School, which is a school for privileged young women in Chelsea. Her family had a beautiful apartment in Chelsea where she would stay. She had servants and you name it. And it was a typical life. Things started changing for her, and her change over to radicalism, which you'll see, was gradual. But the first hint of it occurred in the late 1950s. So when she turned 17, because she was from a well-to-do family, she was expected to be a debutante in 1958. In 1958, as it were, was this incredibly important year to be a debutante in Great Britain, because the Queen, still the same Queen, announced that this would be the last year that she would receive debutantes. Right? So back then, you would actually go before Queen Elizabeth II and present yourself. And the Queen and her sister both decided that the quality of people was diminishing because a lot of people were buying the privilege. But you could see the stakes were really high for the Dugdales, for their daughter to do this, because it was the last chance ever, right? There's no two ways about it. But Rose said she didn't want to do it. She had no interest in it. She saw it as a meat market. Right? It wasn't anything she wanted to be part of. She didn't want to be paraded in front of young, eligible military officers from well-to-do families as a potential wife. And her family was aghast, of course, so they struck a deal with her. And the deal was, if she did the debutante season, they would agree to allow her to attend Oxford. That's what she wanted. Now, again, I'm talking about the contrast between then and now. I have two daughters, and if they approached me and said, "Father, I would love to attend Oxford," I would be overjoyed. And I would do everything humanly possible to make that happen. Back then, it was a deal the parents had to strike, because Oxford wasn't what they wanted for their daughter. They wanted her to be a socialite. She was well-to-do. She would marry well and live that sort of life, live that Downton Abbey sort of rarefied air. This is what they wanted for her, but she had other plans. So she went through the season, hated every minute of it, and then went on to Oxford, where she took the PPE, which is Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, which is a really rigorous, difficult program. And she wasn't a great student. She didn't finish with the first or anything, but she was a hard worker, and she took on the hard studies. She didn't try to float her way through it. Now, another sign that Rose would be sort of a radical was, at the time, the Oxford Union did not allow women to attend, and Rose would have none of that. So she and a friend dressed up as men and went to the Oxford Union, and they broke the glass ceiling there. So they went in dressed this way. Rose understood the consequence of this. That's why they were photographed being made up as men. And you can see how serious she is. That's her on the left. And they went in, and nobody noticed them at first, and they were there long enough to establish the fact that women had penetrated this society. So this was the sort of person Rose was. But she was still a person of her breeding, and she was not a radical in any way. She had no problem with privilege and such. Now, when she finished at Oxford, she decided to pursue a master's degree. I always say, and any of you who've had the misfortune of hearing me lecture before know that I always say, all great art crime has some nexus to Massachusetts, right? It's what we do, bad things. If there's crime, we're involved, and there's some connection. And Rose's is that for her master's degree, she went to Mount Holyoke. So she came to, anybody here alum from Mount Holyoke? Well, if you had been, you would be pleased to know that they have a great archives program, department, and they helped me a great deal. They had all kinds of files on Rose even after she graduated, so I had access to a whole bunch of stuff. I'm surprised they gave me. I think they might think that she has passed, and she has not. But I wasn't about to tell them, so they gave me all of this info about her. Now, this picture is important. Rose Dugdale is still alive today. She's 80 years old. And if you asked her today what her least favorite countries in the world are, she would say Great Britain, she would say the United States, and Israel, okay? But here she is in the United States, fully embracing the whole culture, right? And not being a person of the people at all. She has her little sports car, her little red sports car, shipped over to the United States so she could drive around in it. She's dressed in all this cowboy attire, just soaking in all of the American culture. She even drives across country. She's known as this crazy driver, and she drives all the way over to California during the break and takes a course at Stanford, then drives all the way back alone. Just a wild woman. And again, no inkling that she's going to be a rebel. She finishes at Mount Holyoke, goes back to Great Britain and gets her PhD at Bedford College. Here's another picture of Rose, but you can see she's got a scowl now, and you're going to see a lot of progression in her. So she at first she goes and she works for the UN. Through connections, she gets these jobs in economics with the UN and really starts to learn about the third world and gets a lot of experience in the disparity in wealth throughout the world. And then she becomes a professor. And when she's a professor in Great Britain, she spends a lot of time with the students because she's a young professor. And she's really interested in their movements. Now, some of you in this room will remember that now we're getting into the mid-'60s, right? And in the mid-'60s, you're starting to see a lot of protests on campus around the West, around the Western world, right? Including, not to the extent of the United States, but in London and in Manchester, these things are happening, and students are starting to occupy offices, and she's partaking in this with them, right? She's with the students in these protests, even though she's one of the professors, and the students love her, of course. And then a pivotal time in her life occurs in 1968. And of course, 1968, everybody in this room understands the fact that 1968 was a remarkable year in history, right? It's staggering to think about, the first things that come to mind from an American paradigm are Martin Luther King is assassinated in April, and then in June, Robert F. Kennedy. It's really hard. I remember asking my dad, what was it like to see this on the news? We see a lot of crazy news, right? But back then, the news cycle, what it is today, and you only had a few outlets, but to come home and hear, well, I'll never forget my dad getting choked up talking about coming home and seeing, he worked nights and seeing Robert Kennedy, who he loved, had been assassinated. Rose, and so there's protests in Paris, there's student uprisings around the world, and it's not just these things I mentioned. There are coups d'etats taking place all over the world. This is just an unbelievable period. And of course, Cuba had recently had its revolution, and Castro decided to invite some of the more, trying to think of the right word, well-to-do and famous and outspoken students from the West to come to Cuba, to come to Havana for what he called the Cinco de Mayo camps and to see his revolution firsthand. So Rose, even though she wasn't a student but was an academic, went. And it's a really interesting look into her because, as I always say, if you're in your 50s and there's a 5-year difference between you and another person, that's nothing, right? You're the same. But when you're 27 and you're with 22-year-olds and you're a professor and they're students, there's a big difference, right? There's a big gap there. And she's with these students. Now, I don't have a picture of her in Cuba, how I wish I did, but here's some students there. And the reason I picked this one is one of my favorite writers is Christopher Hitchens, and he was there. So that's him on the right. And he wrote extensively about the experiences at the Cinco de Mayo camps. And again, a great insight into Rose. Many of the students, including Hitchens, came away underwhelmed and unimpressed with Castro. So they would go there, and as soon as you got there, their passports were taken from them. And students were surprised to see this. They couldn't just move about. And then they would go to these speeches by Castro in the hot sun, and they would last 90 minutes or 2 hours, and all of the standing ovations were on cue, right? And his men up in front would stand up, and people would know, all right, we have to stand up too. And Hitchens remembers Castro being up there and saying how he has eradicated prostitution in Cuba. And Hitchens said he turned around and the audience is lined with prostitutes, waiting for the thing to end. But Rose was overwhelmed by it. She loved what she saw, and she really took to the people. So while the students were doing their thing, she would go into the villages and dance and sing and be up all night with the people of Cuba and fell in love with people that we might consider oppressed. But she saw this movement of the lower class, I guess is how they would be described in Great Britain. So when she's done in Cuba and she returns home, She's a different person, and she's no longer a professor. She sells her apartment in Chelsea, and she opens this place. It's the Tottenham Tenants Union. And if you don't know what a tenants union is, I didn't either. So a tenants union is a place in Great Britain where if you need help getting your benefits from the government, you're having problems with the government, you can go to the tenants union and they will help you. If you need a place to live, thus the name, they would help you find one. And Rose took to this as an activist, and she was instantly feared by the civil servants because she would slam open the door, walk in, smack the table on behalf of her clients, for free, but they're her clients, and demand their privileges. She would get people who needed homes and turn them into squatters. She would just bring them into apartments and have them live there so that they'd have a place to stay. And she became rather famous. And the poor people in Tottenham, which is a working class area, lower working class area, started thinking of her as the angel of Tottenham because she, still wealthy, her parents were sending her all sorts of money. She had tons of money at her disposal, and she was giving it away. And she was a really soft touch, and a lot of people who even didn't need it would come get money from her. And I don't think she really cared. It wasn't her money. She believed it belonged to the people. And while she was there, she met a guy named Walter Heaton. Walter Heaton was 9 years older than Rose. Walter's still alive today. I talk to him often. He's a really fascinating guy. Walter was a union leader, and he was very charismatic and loud and really well-schooled on power to the people sort of causes. And he met Rose at a union protest, and they instantly became like Velcro. These two were together constantly, and they fell in love. And despite the fact that Walter was living with his wife and daughters, they carried on an affair in which Rose referred to him as her common-law husband and would stay at his house at night and hang out there and speak broken Gaelic to him. Why Gaelic? Because the two of them decided they were going to take up the cause of Irish republicanism. And it makes sense because in around 1969, the rebirth of Irish republicanism, the civil rights movement in Ireland, gathered steam again. People started fighting for their rights again. And if you know anything about this, and I found it incredibly fascinating, the people of Northern Ireland were adopting the nonviolent protest approach of Martin Luther King. But they were met with extreme violence, and they were met with this violence not just by the people, but from the police, from the Royal Ulster Constabulary. They would join in on the beatings of these peaceful protesters in Ulster. And the Republican movement quickly abandoned their nonviolent approach. So you can't help but notice in this picture what's on top of Rose's tenants union, right? Now, to us sitting here, many of you probably have Irish ancestry. You see that and you think nothing. But it's 1969, 1970 in Great Britain. That's a big deal. You're putting the Irish tricolor above your storefront at a time when the newspaper headlines are constantly about conflict and even bombings in Northern Ireland and different sorts of, not warfare, but interactions between the British military and Republicans. So they made themselves very well known, not just to activists and the needy, but this is Walter with Rose. You can see Rose is looking a bit different here now. She starts adopting a different style of dress. When she came back from Cuba, she didn't wear camouflage or like a military uniform like Castro did, but she wore very activist sort of clothing. I'm trying to think of the right way to say it in 2021, but she was wearing things that would sort of militant looking. And they're at protest. They're at this protest in particular, they're always raising the clenched fist, and they're protesting on behalf of American prisoners, black prisoners in the United States who were treated harshly in a California prison. So these two are doing all of their activist work, but at the same time, they're also on the radar for the special branch, which is, these, I wouldn't want to say elite unit of the state police, but your officers who are investigating higher level crimes because they're running guns to Northern Ireland. Now, the most fascinating thing about this story to me in terms of the era is the way women were perceived. So I started out writing this about a woman who stole art. It's interesting, okay. But when you look at the way women were viewed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, staggering difference from today. In Rose's time, whenever she would get into trouble, it would be worldwide news. It would be in the newspapers in America because here's this British heiress, PhD from Oxford, getting in trouble, right? What's interesting to me is every time commentators would address this in the newspaper, on television, radio, and the BBC, or even in the courtroom, they would assume that Rose had fallen under the influence of a man. And in this instance, it would be Walter Heaton. Surely she's under the influence of Walter. And what I found attractive about Rose, and I know that's a controversial thing to say about someone who committed terrorist acts, but one of the things that drew me to her is that it was the opposite. The men were under her influence. But no one in the media could fathom that. No one in the courts could fathom that these men were following her, but that was the case. And Walter will tell you today that it was the woman who was leading the charge, and it was the men that were captivated by her charisma and her gusto. In fact, I asked Walter, who is very robust, but his wife does all the typing for him, so she would read the emails and type the answers. And I said, first question, Walter, what do you remember about Rose? How would you describe her? And he said to me, through his wife, she was a patriot, a fierce fighter, and a ferocious lover. And I was like, I cannot imagine asking my wife to write that about my ex-girlfriend. But well done, Rose. So one of the photographs, I love photographs in them too. I've said before, I'm a big admirer of period photography, right? So this is Rose being interviewed by the media, and Walter's watching on. Now, Walter is a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. He's a man of the people, but he also has Rose Dugdale with a lot of money. And she buys him the finest suits. He's dressed incredibly well all the time, the latest fashions. She even buys him a Mercedes, which is a real contrast to the image he tries to portray. That aside, this picture tells, as they say, 1,000 words, right? Rose is doing the talking to the media that's there to interview them in their office. Walter's looking at her like he's looking at, his hero. He's just so taken by her in this picture, and till today, he is completely taken and moved by her, and I just love that. So I mentioned Rose was spending all her money, and part of the problem associated with that is eventually she ran out of it, right? She was giving it away, she was giving it to Walter, she's carrying on this affair right in front of his wife, and out of guilt, I believe, gave his wife, 1973, 28,000 pounds, right? I would take that now and be very, very happy. It's 1973, right? And she gave that to his wife. I'm thinking it had to be guilt, right? That's all I could think. And it's a complex time for women's rights in the world, and it's a very complex time for Rose because I've seen interviews. I couldn't find the people to tell me because they had passed, but that Walter was may have been somewhat physically abusive to Rose. And Rose would tell her friends that she didn't mind because that's how the real working class lived, right? Because she didn't really understand how the real working, I'm sure that was a component of life, don't get me wrong, but she's guessing, right? And she's trying to do everything she can to be authentic. And that's something she struggles with for years. So when they're out of money, Rose and Walter know they need more. So she turns to the only source she's ever known, her parents, right? But now she's a different person. So what she and Walter do is get a couple of other activists / bad guys. And when the family's off at the Epsom Derby, which is sort of like our Kentucky Derby, they're away for the weekend, Rose and Walter go to Yardie Farm where she grew up, and they break into the home and they steal the father's art collection, which is not masterpieces, but they're more than I could afford, and they're antiques, right? Now, Rose and Walter pull it off, and they're good at pulling off crimes, but they're not so good at the what happens next part, right? So They steal this stuff. The police investigate. The house staff even knows it's Rose because none of the dogs or other animals on the farm made a noise when she was there because the animals all loved her, right? And when they looked, they saw the only room that hadn't been ransacked was Rose's bedroom. And the one really nice antique that had been left behind was a gift from Rose to her mother, right? So they quickly settled on Rose. And she and Walter were arrested. And back then, the wheels of justice moved quickly. So they went to court really soon, and they were both convicted easily. But Walter and Rose both learned from one of their favorite groups, which is the Black Panthers, that the courtroom provided them with a political bully pulpit, and they could stand up there and make their political statements like I'm doing with you. I could just proselytize and tell you what I think. And Walter got up there first, and I mentioned this view of himself, right? He gets up, and when the judge gives him his sentence, I think it was 8 years, because Walter had an extensive criminal record already. He says, not since Christ has there been a greater travesty of justice, right? So that's a heck of a self-promotion, I would say. When Rose got up, she attacked her father, but her attack was couched in love. Because her mother and father never gave up on her, and her father is as close as we are. And she says to him, I love you, Daddy, but I hate everything you stand for. And her poor father is sitting there, and all the press is there, and the judge gives her 5 years but suspends the sentence. And he gives her a fine and says to her, you're responsible for this crime, but you've fallen under the influence of a man. Unbelievable miscarriage of justice and mischaracterization, and then says he's suspending the sentence because I find it highly unlikely you will ever offend again. Talk about famous last words from a judge, right? So another great photo that tells you the time. This is Rose and Walter leaving after court, right? And look at Walter. He knows gig is up. I'm going away for 6 to 8 years. Horrible time for Walter. Rose, on the other hand, is very happy, not because she's getting out, mind you, but because she's been arrested and convicted. Because, again, she's struggling with this identity and trying to be genuine. I guess nowadays you call it imposter syndrome, right? And she wants to be accepted as a rebel, as a revolutionary. It's an era in which activists are talking about a thing called direct action, right? And direct action is like, when I talk to college students, I say, it's the difference between the guy that sits at his computer and tweets power to the people and, say, like an Antifa person who is out trying to burn down the courthouse in Portland. Clearly not condoning either. And if you know me, you know I'm definitely not condoning that. So, but Rose, that's Rose, direct action, right? It's a badge of honor. I believe she wanted to go to prison, right? Because this is how she could get her bona fides with the people. But she doesn't go to prison. So when she walks out, you can see she is not shy from the media cameras, and she poses with the clenched fist as usual, and she gives the peace sign as well. And her poor Walter goes away to prison, and she promises him she's going to visit him on every visiting day. And even she has an outstanding traffic violation, right? And she fought it in court just so Walter could have to come to court so she could see him in person, right? Loves him that much, pledges her undying love to him, is outside the courthouse protesting on his behalf, free Wally Heaton, the people's best friend, your fear is greater than ours. I don't really know what she means by that, but that, these protest signs, gets a lot of coverage. And then 2.5 months later, just before Christmas, never sees Walter again. She just walks away. Nobody knew where she didn't say goodbye to her friends. She held some fundraiser, activist cause for a Christmas fundraiser, and then was gone. Bye, Walter? Nope. Just see you later. Where did she go? She went to Ireland. And when she goes to Ireland, she immediately, and I mean immediately, hooks up with an Irish Republican soldier named Eddie Gallagher. And Eddie, unlike Walter, is younger than her, but I think it's 6 years. And Eddie is perfect for Rose because say what you will about the IRA. We all have our personal opinions, and I express none in the book. But regardless of any horrors they may have committed or revolutionary acts, if you will, they were strategic, and they had a hierarchy, and they followed it. And that's why they were one of the reasons you could call them an army. Eddie had no time for that. Eddie wanted to go out and blow things up, right? And for Eddie, it was to hell with the hierarchy, and he had his own active service unit. So the IRA has these ASUs, an active service unit. He had his own, and the IRA tolerated him because he was on the right side, but his actions were counter to what they were trying to accomplish. So he might try to blow something up at the same time there's a peace talk, or maybe a ceasefire in a certain area when he's, robbing a bank for the IRA and just a problem. So he's perfect for Rose, right? Because Rose is direct action, and that's what she wants to do. There's no time for, stratum of leadership. We need to do things, we need to do them now. So she's not in Ireland for more than 2 months when she and Eddie come up with a plan. Rose poses as a journalist. She goes out to a helicopter rental company in Ireland, and she says that she needs to rent a helicopter for a tour. She asks the captain, will you fly me over County Wicklow? I need to take some pictures, and I'm writing about it. And he says, of course I will. So on the appointed day, Rose shows up to the helicopter. Just before they board, here comes 3 guys out of the bushes. They're carrying big milk churns and guns, and they hijack the helicopter. They tell the captain to get behind the yoke. The milk churns they packed with explosives, including Rose, by hand. And they put them into a helicopter. 2 of them were too heavy for the helicopter, so they had to leave them behind. And they order him to fly to Strabane, which at the moment was the most bombed city in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And they tell him to hover over a Royal Ulster Constabulary, and they're going to drop the explosives on the police barracks. Imagine the bloodshed. It would have been a mass murder that no one would have ever forgotten, right? The helicopter hovers over, and they're having trouble because of the weight. One of the milk churns falls harmlessly into the water. The other falls onto the rocks near the police station, but it doesn't explode because, again, they're good criminals in terms of an idea and starting it off, but they don't see the end result, and they're not good bomb makers. So the bombs don't explode, right? And the media talks to the police officers there, and they chuckle and they say, oh, we watched and laughed as these things fell. No, it was the first aerial assault on British territory since the Blitz, right? It's the first terrorist attack by air. Rose Dugdale, right? And I'm reading this. Don't forget, I started off reading about an art thief. Now I'm reading about a woman that's dropping bombs, trying to bomb a police station from a helicopter. So the bombs fall helplessly. He gives this, the police give this interview. They chuckle about it. However, the fact of the matter is the police knew that this was a serious matter. So when they were laughing about it in the media, that was them trying to tell the IRA and Rose Dugdale and the rest that they're not concerned. But they were very, very concerned because hundreds of people would have died, and his brothers and sons and uncles and nephews. It would have been horrific, of course. So all of a sudden, wanted posters for Rose stopped popping up in Northern Ireland, and they picked the worst photo of Rose they can find. And in the wanted ad, I don't have my glasses on, but they say, they take some shots of her. They say she has a masculine appearance. She, usually wears slacks and suede jackets of dirty and untidy appearance. And they give one of her aliases. They say she has a sallow complexion. That's a British sensibility sort of attack on her. So they're looking for her. They know this is a person that was running guns. She's an IRA supporter. She's with Eddie Gallagher, and now she tried to bomb a police station. Remarkable. That's Rose. She's now on the run because she knows the police are onto her because of these posters, and she has to start dressing more feminine as a disguise. She's wearing wigs. But one of her problems is when they're going to IRA safe houses, not everybody wants her because everyone knows she's this British debutante. And many of the people who are living with the troubles and living with the bombings and losing their sons and all these horrors of the time wonder, is she just having fun with us? Is this just her fad that she's going through at our expense? At the same time all of this is going on, these two sisters, Dolores and Marion Price, some of you might know them or recognize the names. Dolores and Marion, Dolores is 20, and Marion on the left, her sister, is 18. They have grown up living the life that Rose, in her romantic notions, would have lived. They are living with the troubles. They are the people I just described. Their father was in the original IRA in the 1920s. Dolores would say, these two are really captivating young women. And they would say, when other kids would hear fairy tales at their father's knee, our father would be telling us, oh, they hung old Jimmy today, because they're fighting. Their aunt had lost all of her fingers, her eyesight, in an explosion when she was transporting or trying to transport explosives for the IRA. This was a true IRA family. And their mother was involved in an IRA branch. I can't pronounce it. It's a Gaelic name, but where women would assist. It was like the women's unit, but the women at the time in the original IRA, that would mean like you'd be cleaning bullet casings or, arranging dinner for the boys, that sort of thing. Dolores, even at 20, and her sister Marion, who followed her, wanted none of that. They were soldiers. They joined the IRA. They were sworn as soldiers. They were amongst the first two soldiers. And Dolores, on the right, was the first OC in the IRA, which is officer commanding, which meant she was going to lead an attack. And Dolores, her belief, and she says with Jerry Adams, she claims, was that bombings are going off in Northern Ireland and it is not affecting the British people and they're not taking action against their government. We need to bring the bombs to them. So they did. They pulled off, they went to 4 car bombings in a single day. And they put the cars, these two and 2 men, Feeney and Kelly, easy names to remember, they put the bombs outside of New Scotland Yard, police station, Army barracks, and the biggest one and the most successful one outside the Old Bailey in London, where is storied courthouse. And the IRA would give warnings ahead of time. They weren't looking to kill people, they were looking to make a statement. But the warning didn't get communicated properly for the Old Bailey. And there were people outside, and hundreds of people were injured very badly, but no one was killed. One person died of a heart attack, but it wasn't related. They later determined it wasn't related. It's almost like the Boston Marathon bombing, God forgive me, without the deaths, but all of these people grievously injured. The Price sisters and Feeney and Kelly had a great, before the bombs even went off, they head to the airport, so they would be out in time. But there was a grass, what we call a rat in Boston. Someone told on them, and the police were waiting for them there. And they went right to jail, right to prison. Now, when they went to prison, Dolores, who's the officer commanding, and her sister, demand, of course, to be sent to Northern Ireland to serve their sentence and to be treated as political prisoners, which meant they would have more privileges. They would be allowed to dress in civilian clothes. They would have more visitors. They would be closer to their families. They could have more intermingling between each other. But the British government decided with them, no, you're going to be treated as criminals. So the Price sisters led the Feeney and Kelly, and they went on a hunger strike. And many of you, like I do, remember the hunger strikes. Even when I was a wee lad, and I remember my father, even though he was Italian-American, was a great fan of Bobby Sands, who's the 40th anniversary of his death just passed. And I think it was probably the Catholic connection. But just remembering him with these hunger strikes, and you're seeing, if you follow this sort of thing, you see every couple of weeks the anniversary of someone else's hunger strike death, because it's 40 years now. They went on hunger strike. The government said, what are we going to do? Are we going to move them? Are we going to give in? And they said, no, we're going to force feed them. And I did a lot of research on force feeding, and it's not what you think. It's 1,000 times worse. And the sisters got even sicker when they were being force fed. It's really a brutal operation where they put sort of this wooden block with a hole in it in your mouth, like a dentist would, sort of, to keep your mouth open. And then they would jam this tube through, and it would cut their esophagus, and just blended protein, and they couldn't keep it down. So they became very ill, and for the newspapers are reporting on them, again, especially because of the era, they were attractive young females, and it made for great news around the world. So everyone knew the Price sisters and their plight. In February of 1974, thieves went to the Kenwood House in Great Britain. Has anybody been to the Kenwood House? Outstanding. Oh, good. Excellent. So Kenwood House is this beautiful museum, not on the level of the Gardner, of course, but a nice place. And they have a Vermeer. They have this Vermeer, the guitar player, which is just, I'm a huge Vermeer fan. So every Vermeer painting I say, oh, it's just incredible. You should see. But it is. And like all Vermeers, it's a mystery. So you look at her and you wonder, why did Vermeer cut her off at her arm here? Was he trying to tell us there was someone else in the room? Is that who she's looking at? What's the story behind this? And we'll never know, but you could think about it forever. And thieves in the middle of the night went to Kenwood House, they broke a window and they stole this painting. They cut the phone lines, they locked the guards in the building by putting chains around the doors and the outside. And they made off with this painting, and nobody would say that they saw anything because Kenwood House, the surrounding area, at the time was a place where gay men would gather for rendezvous. And at the time, no one would want to admit that they were there, right? So no one saw anything. And the painting's gone. And soon the police and the media were getting letters saying a bunch of different scenarios, but finally they said, this painting is stolen for you to return the Price sisters to Northern Ireland. And the police said, we need some bona fides. The next letter came, and it was a little piece of the canvas inside the letter. Now, it was canvas from the tacking edge of the painting, so it didn't affect the painting, but now they knew. So the police are looking for the guitar player by Vermeer. They have no idea where to look. Nothing else in the gallery was taken. That gallery has Rembrandts and Rubens and you name it. And then some weeks later, in April, so I think it was 6 weeks later, this place is called the Rossborough House, the titular house that I mentioned. Now, it's tough to get a photo of the Rossborough House in its entirety because it's the longest house in Ireland. And if you get a photo, even a panoramic one that shows it from end to end, it's so small that it doesn't do you any good. So it's an enormous place, and it's owned by Sir Alfred Bite and his wife Clementine, and they're heirs to the De Beers diamond fortune. They are the 1/10 of 1%, okay? And in this place, they have an art collection that will rival a museum. It'll rival the Kenwood House. And one evening, at about 9 o'clock, a woman approaches the employee entrance, and every time I say that, I think, that's what happened at the Gardner. They approach the employee entrance, and this woman comes, and a 14-year-old son of one of the servants opens the door, and the woman is speaking in broken French, and she says, my car is broken down, can I use your phone? And the car is in the distance, and 14-year-old boy, he said his name was Patrick Pollard, and he said, sure, come in. And when he opens the door fully, in walks the woman, and 3 men with automatic weapons come barreling in. And the men go right for the work staff, and they take them all. They're a little rough with them, but they secure them in a room, and they're telling them, we're sorry we have to do this, we're not here for you, just like the Gardner. But quick preface, this has nothing to do with the Gardner. They were not involved in the Gardner Museum heist, but echoes, right? So they put the staff into a room, secure them, then they go to the drawing room where Sir Alfred and Lady Clementine are listening to phonographs. And they barge in there and they yell at them, get on the floor, face down. And the Bites do as they're told, but they think it's some sort of practical joke, right? And they're laying face down next to each other. And then these people are yelling at them, you capitalist pigs, you're taking the money of the working people. And they strike Sir Alfred in the head and he's bleeding. Now they know these people mean business. They take Lady Clementine and they tie her up and they drag her into the basement and put her on the dirt floor, and they're saying these horrible things to her. And she thinks they're going to be killed, right? And they go back to Sir Alfred, and there's a fly just driving me crazy, and it must be my hairspray. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to talk and it's going to fly in my mouth. That'll be great for the video. So Sir Alfred is watching this, and the woman with the French accent no longer has a French accent. She has a posh British accent because it's Rose Dugdale. And Rose is taking these 3 men that are with her, and she's pointing out what paintings to take, right? And the men with her wouldn't know the paintings in this room from the photographs in this room. They have no idea, and I'm not insulting them, they just weren't born amongst them. In fact, when the police got the call to respond to the Rossborough house for this theft, when the detective got there, he called back to headquarters and said, there must be $1 million worth of paintings stolen from here. Massive understatement. But his commanding officer responded, scoffed at him and said, there aren't $1 million worth of paintings in all of Ireland, right? Little did he know what was in the Rossborough house. Rose chose incredibly well. She was bred to choose these paintings incredibly well. She studied fine arts. When she was at Oxford, she chose paintings for one of the student union rooms. Her mother was dabbled in watercolors and worked at an art gallery. She knew what to take. She chose paintings that would have a room in any great art museum, again, except for the Gardner, because we can't accept new paintings. But she took multiple paintings by Rubens, Franz Hall, Velázquez. She took 2 Gainsboroughs. If you're wondering who Gainsborough is, one of his paintings, a print of one of his paintings is in the ladies' room over here. Don't ask how I know that. But Blue Boy by Gainsborough is in the ladies' room over here. And of course, the most important painting that she stole, Lady Writing a Letter by Vermeer. And this painting is, again, I'm so biased in favor of Vermeer, but I can't help it. When you look at this painting, and I know you can't see it great from there, but everything about it begs you to stare at it as I have and wonder what's going on in the story. So she's sitting there writing a letter, but you can't tell, is she upset or is she fine? Right? It's just writing to a friend, but there's signs that she might be upset because the chair is moved away. Was there a gentleman sitting there earlier? On the floor, which you can't see, but when you all buy the book and see the color image that I paid for to be in that book, so you got to buy it, you see on the floor, there's a crumbled up letter in an empty envelope. And is she responding to a letter that someone sent to her that upset her? And you can see the way her maid is looking out the window. Really study that. And you can make an argument that she's just looking out the window, but you can make a better argument that she's looking out the window like, oh boy, this is a problem. So they took this as well, so this Vermeer. The paintings they stole nowadays, the value would be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Rose pulled off the biggest art heist to date on that day in April of 1974. The police respond, as I say, they were surprised to know that there were paintings of that value there. This is a crime scene photo. You can see the frames left behind. That's not uncommon. That's more common than not because frames are cumbersome. So they, a lot of times, just take the painting off the frame and leave them behind. And for the final time, Rose has shown that her plans for robbing things are good. Her plans for after she steals them are not so good. So they use a series of stolen cars for their getaway, and Rose's plan takes them to West Cork, but she thinks that if you go out to an isolated area, you won't be found, not realizing that in Ireland, if you're not from there and you're in this isolated area, everyone knows you're there, right? So people noticed when the cars were abandoned. They find this abandoned car with a driver's license in it. It's one of Rose's aliases, right? And then they put the word out, have you seen this woman? The guy that rented the cottage to him was, oh, absolutely, Interestingly, the 3 men who did this with her, disappear. They're never arrested to this day. None of them. I know who they are. Everyone knows who they are. Well, everyone knows Eddie was involved. He was never arrested. They took off. Rose stayed. And when she was arrested, she was driving a car with the paintings in the boot. And when you read this and you study her, you can't help but think she was resigned to the fact that it was time to go to prison. Now, she doesn't say that, but that's my pop psychologist view, right? And one of the pieces of evidence I offer you is this photograph of her after she's been arrested and driven away, right? She's made her bones. And she gets sentenced for not just this robbery, the biggest heist in history, but also for the bombing attempt. But she gets concurrent sentences, pure class justice, as she would say. Now, Rose can't do anything on a small scale, or she can't avoid the spotlight, even unintentionally. When she goes to jail, now, first of all, don't forget, she left Wally saying he was the love of her life and she was fully committed to him, and then within weeks she was with Eddie Gallagher. When she gets to prison, she's not feeling well. So she smuggles a jar of her urine to her attorney, and they find Rose is pregnant. So when she goes to prison, the prison authorities, the government at the highest level, are trying to figure out, what do we do? Do we let her go to a hospital? They decide not to. They build a maternity ward in the prison. And she's the first woman to give birth in an Irish prison. That's her son, Rory, who, cut to the chase, is just a wonderful guy. He's alive and well. Eddie reemerges some years later with a plot to free his child's mother. I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to give it away because you have to have a reason to buy the book. What Eddie does is so unbelievable that many of the people that I contacted 50 years later to talk about Rose Dugdale only remembered her from what Eddie did. So I urge you to buy the book to read what Eddie did. You know, I remember when the first time I wrote a book, it's been 10 years now, and I gave a talk, and someone said, "That was a really interesting talk. Thank you for telling the story, but you didn't leave me any reason to buy the book." So there's your reason to buy the book. Now, one of my favorite things about the story is I fall in love with these characters, and I didn't fall in love with Rose, even though when Irish broadcasters interview me, they always say, "Oh, Anthony, you really quite like Rose Dugdale, don't you?" And it's not that I like her, I admire her. There's one thing you can say about her, is that she believed in what she was fighting for. And there's something to be admired in that, even if just grudgingly. You know, this is someone who has a belief and they follow it and they're undeterred. Years later, when she's released from prison, she goes right to Sinn Féin and she's running their education branch. Now, the person I fell in love with reading this book is Dolores Price. And this is a horrible thing to say, but this is good for Titcombs. There's a great book about Dolores Price called Say Nothing out there too. So read mine first. That sold a lot of copies. He doesn't need my plug. Patrick Radden Keefe wrote it. Fantastic guy. I know him well. Great guy. So what I am taken by is Dolores' upbringing and her own belief. But what's interesting to me is that Dolores, as I mentioned, starts off as a soldier with Jerry Adams, right? She's the real deal, and she's fighting for her cause. Dolores, later in life, at 63, dies suddenly. Alcohol and related to alcohol and substance abuse. She suffered tremendous PTSD from her ordeal in prison. It's a really tragic story. She was married to the actor Stephen Ray, great Irish actor who was in The Crying Game. It's probably his most famous movie. By the end of her life, she's completely disillusioned with Jerry Adams and the IRA as she knew it. She said very vocally that this is not the Good Friday Accords, the peace process, was not what she fought for. She fought for full independence for Ireland. And in a weird way, it affected my book. She gave interviews. So some of you may remember that there was an oral history project at Boston College, and then those people were promised that their stories would never be told, and then people went to court and the British government to prosecute people, and they got access to a lot of the stories. And I spoke to a number of those people for the book. Dolores was one of them, and more importantly, Dolores gave an interview for a documentary. And the agreement was it wouldn't be released until she was dead. And she was only 63 years old. You would figure she had many, many more years to go, but she dies suddenly. And the documentary's out there. It's called I, Dolores. It's on Netflix. And it's just tragic how her life went. It breaks my heart to think about how things turned out for Dolores. Starts as a true dyed-in-the-wool Republican, ends dismayed and hates Jerry Adams. In fact, she says Jerry Adams ordered the murder, now her name is escaping me, of a mother of 11 or 12 children who was taken out and killed. She says it was Jerry Adams who ordered it. Now they're enemies. Rose starts off as this British aristocrat who has trouble being accepted, but ultimately ends up completely accepted by the IRA. Today, she's a hero. Today, she's celebrated. Here she is signing the regrets book when Castro died. And here she is with Jerry Adams at a parade. And to think of the way these two lives intersected. Again, I really believe if Rose could have been born anyone else, it would have been Dolores Price. When she stole these paintings from the Rossborough House, her goal was to free Dolores Price from the British prison in England and put her in Northern Ireland and ultimately win her freedom. Amazingly, maybe this is why I love Dolores, when this was happening and they were demanding these Vermeers be swapped for her movement, Dolores sent word to the media and to the thieves through her father saying how much she loves Vermeer and loves art, and she wants them to give the paintings back. She didn't want her demands to be agreed to because of these paintings and for people to miss the paintings on her behalf. She wanted to be moved on principle. So it's just the way these two lives went in different directions, stunning to me. Now I know I came to talk to you about an art theft tonight, and it's the biggest art heist of its time, but the reason I love this book and I miss writing it, I miss researching it, is because I started writing about an art thief, but I wound up writing about a woman. And the way things progressed, not just for her from 1957 until the way the world is today, but the way things changed for women writ large throughout history. So I hope that many of you buy this book tonight, and I hope that when you read it, you see the context to this story. It's not just some true crime story. It's much deeper than that. Now, I never give a talk about anything with the hubris to believe that if you have questions, you'll only ask them about this book. I know there's some other pressing things you may have questions about. So if you have questions about the Gardner Museum without betraying the investigation, of course I'll answer them. But before I take any questions are okay, Ann? Before I do, I just want to sincerely thank you all for, it was a long drive here, and to see all the seats filled is gratifying. And see, everybody here and healthy, coming out to hear a talk in person is just a great thing. Who would have thought that would be something to celebrate, right? But anytime I can see hope, I'm happy too. So thank you very, very much, and I'm willing to answer questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Yes, sir.
Unfortunately, I do have a question about the garden.
It's okay.
Allow me to put a little twist on it. I had read with great interest what the Boston Globe had reviewed a couple of years ago in a series about the whole thing. And it struck me that those who were in this garage in Georgia, the perpetrators, did not seem to have the wit to be able to plan something as sophisticated as that robbery, or even be able to manage the result of having gotten these paintings. What do you know or suspect about the perpetrator actually masterminding that robbery?
Well, there's many parts to that question. First, never believe everything you read in the Globe. Okay? And, the Globe, I know the Globe has done a podcast that I was in. I know there was a documentary I haven't seen. I didn't listen to the podcast either. I don't read news stories about the Gardner. God bless reporters. They have a very hard job, and it's very hard to get information out of us, right? But I always tell people, but there's one FBI agent, Jeff Kelly, wonderful guy, and I working on this case now together for 16 years. We have a case file that's around 70,000 pages, right? That no reporter has access to, no documentarian has access to. I wouldn't sit here and say the perpetrators came from that garage in Dorchester. But what I would say to you is, number one, the circumstances you just described about people not having the bandwidth, say, to come up with such a sophisticated plot or to know what to do with the paintings afterward is the norm, not the exception. So in other words, when art theft happens, Rose, again, is an outlier. When people get into museums at night, it's either one, by a ruse, or two, by staying behind in the museum after closing. In Boston, the Wild West, in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, and the early 90s, using a police uniform to pull off a heist of any sort, or a crime, or a robbery, complete norm. Complete norm. It was a piece of cake to get uniforms. I know where people used to get the uniforms. Some of you might know I know Miles Connor really, really well. Police uniforms, that's like, that's first grade stuff for them. Second, I'd say about the plot to get in being sophisticated, I would say it's not sophisticated at all. When you think about what the thieves planned was to ring the doorbell and say they were Boston police. And as many of you do know, and is the truth, the policy and protocol at the museum of the time was not to let police in unless you had called them. And if you had not called them, you would dial 911, which was a perfect fail-safe. Because if they were not supposed to be there, you'd know and don't let them in. And we're on our way. So the guard failed to do that, right? If he had followed protocol, and I'm not picking on the guy, it's human error leads to all sorts of horrible things. But if he had done that, these two thieves would have had to get back in their car and drive away empty-handed. So their plan depended upon human error. And that's very, very common. It's not uncommon. Now, the second part about not knowing what to do with the paintings once they got them, that is even more common. So that's why paintings are so hard to find. Thieves who steal art, even the highest value art, are your common criminals. And this is data. This is not theory. And they steal art knowing that it's easier to steal than, say, diamonds. And when you rob banks, you don't get much money. But they soon learn the next morning when they wake up and read, in our case, $200–300 million worth of art is stolen, and the pictures are plastered worldwide, you can't do anything with them. But so what? You hide them and you go back to stealing other stuff like you always do. Now, when that's why the cliche is the art in art theft is not stealing, it's selling, right? That's why it becomes so hard for these things to move. Now, when you steal paintings and you hide them, it is unlike hiding a fugitive. So Whitey Bulger was caught because you have to go to the doctors and the hairdresser and CVS and get food, right? So people have to see you. But if you're a painting, you don't have to eat or take medicine or see a doctor. You just sit there in a crawl space or behind drywall or under somebody's bed until someone like me finally comes and finds you. So that's why paintings take so long, and that's why usually masterpieces are found either right away because there's a grass, or a generation later because the scariest bad guys die and people are willing to talk, like ex-wives and estranged children and such. So hopefully that answered that for you, but I wouldn't go home tonight saying, oh, the thieves came out of TRC Auto Electric on Dorchester Ave. That's what the media says. You're welcome. Great question, though. It was really, really a great question. I think I answered every question with that answer. Yes, sir.
Do you believe there's any connection between the Gardner heist and the Banks Howard heist?
That's an awesome question. So I would say that your great state representative, Steve Zaros, was one of the investigators on that case. I would say that I don't believe there's a connection in terms of being the same thieves. I would say the MO is dramatically similar. And I would say that in Massachusetts, when you talk about a connection between criminals, it's impossible not to connect criminals, right? So like the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon thing, you can do that with any criminal in Massachusetts. They're all connected. This place is mesmerizing for crime. And back then it was even more. I think my personal belief is that the internet, this incredible web is based on crime in Massachusetts, this incredible web. I'm just kidding. But I mean, it's this web of people who knew who and who was a prison, who was in Dare Island with this guy. It's remarkable, and it's exciting and intriguing for an investigator, but you got to come to an end sometimes, Anthony, and you need to find those paintings. I understand that. So I don't think it's the same guys, but I would be shocked if they didn't know each other or if they weren't inspired by the same person. I believe Miles Connor was the inspiration for the Gardner theft, inadvertently or purposefully. But and again, he's a great friend of mine, and he would tell me, he's told me everything he can, and he's made great efforts to try to help me, but he doesn't know where the paintings are. But I'm fascinated by the theft you just mentioned, sir. Thank you for asking that. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think it's gone beyond a national to an international scope?
The Gardner paintings? Oh, the question was, do I think they've gone beyond the national and into an international scope? I would say no. So oftentimes, every few years, the media will say there's a connection to the IRA. It's made up of whole cloth. No, there's never been one scintilla of evidence that the IRA was in any way involved. And even in the course of writing this book, I spoke to a number of IRA people. And believe me, $10 million, they would tell you in a second. And they start asking around. But the IRA had nothing to do. The thieves were local thieves. And more importantly, art that's stolen in the United States stays in the United States. So it's very rare for a painting, especially a masterpiece, to take the risk of beating customs in 2 continents when you could just drive it to California without your trunk ever being open. So like many things, we're a consumer society, including art and including stolen art. We buy it, but we don't sell it overseas. Yes?
Excuse me. I don't want to interrupt, but the ice cream is melting.
Oh, sorry.
Anthony, would you like to join us over here?
I will see. Can I answer just one last one?
Yeah.
Just use this one.
I was curious if you pronounce your last name Amore or Amore, and what part of Italy your father's family came from.
I pronounce my name like Dean Martin pronounces my name, Amore. And my family came... Yep, thank you. And my family came from the poorest part of Naples. They're peasants who came to America via... They landed in New York and settled in the Bronx, which is why I'm a Yankee fan. Thank you very much, everybody.